Good evening, and welcome back to DriftToSleep. I'm really glad you're here. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to settle in, adjust your pillow, soften your breathing, and let the day slowly fall away. Tonight, we travel back more than 2,500 years to a land of mountains and silence, to a city without walls, to a king remembered not for conquest, but for standing still. Tonight's story is the life of King Leonidas of Sparta. If you're new here, this channel is a quiet place for long, immersive historical storytelling, designed to help you relax, unwind, and gently drift off to sleep. And before we begin, I'd love to know something. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let me know in the comments, whether it's early morning where you are, late at night, or somewhere in between. I always find it comforting to imagine this small, quiet community spread across the globe, all listening together. And if you enjoy slow, detailed stories from history, told calmly and without rush, consider subscribing. There are many more journeys ahead, so dim the lights. Close your eyes if you'd like, and let us begin. Long before King Leonidas stood in the narrow pass of Thermopylae, before the clash of bronze and iron, before his name became a quiet echo through centuries, there was land. Hard land. The valley of the Eurotas lay stretched between mountain and sky in the southern Peloponnese. To the west rose Mount Taygetus, dark, ridged, and immovable. To the east stood Mount Parnon, sealing the valley like a pair of watchful guardians. Between them ran the thin ribbon of the river, patient and unhurried. This was Laconia. This was Sparta. Unlike the bustling cities of Athens or Corinth, Sparta did not shimmer with marble temples or crowded marketplaces. It did not boast towering walls. It did not glitter with ornament. It stood open to the air. Its strength was not in stone, but in its people. Sparta was not built to impress the eye. It was built to endure. And into this land, around 540 BCE, a child was born into the Aegean royal house. That child would become King Leonidas, but when he first opened his eyes, he was not a king. He was the third son of King Anaxandridas II, a second branch of a complicated bloodline. In Sparta, kingship passed through two royal families, the Aeacids and the Eurypontids, who ruled together in a rare dual monarchy. It was a system old even then, woven deep into Spartan identity. Yet Leonidas, as a third son, stood far from the certainty of a throne. No one would have whispered that he would one day command 300 men into legend. At his birth, there would have been no prophecy, no omens, only the customs of Sparta. For in this city, newborns were not celebrated with softness. They were examined. Spartan elders would inspect an infant to judge its strength. According to later tradition, recorded by Plutarch, a weak child might be left exposed in a ravine at Mount Taygetus. Whether this practice was truly widespread or partially mythologized, it reveals something essential about Spartan culture. Strength was survival, and survival was everything. The boy who would become King Leonidas passed whatever scrutiny faced him. He was permitted to live, to grow, to be shaped by a society unlike any other in Greece. Sparta had not always been this way. Centuries earlier, it had been a typical Greek polis, but after conquering neighboring Messenia, Sparta gained vast lands, and with them, a large population of subjugated people known as helots. These helots worked the fields, farmed the grain, tended the livestock. They greatly outnumbered Spartan citizens, and they hated their masters. Sparta's entire political and social structure evolved around this imbalance. The Spartan citizen class lived in constant awareness that revolt was possible, that one day the helots might rise. And so, Spartan boys were trained not merely to fight foreign enemies, but to maintain dominance over those beneath them. This tension shaped everything. The government of Sparta was layered and deliberate. 2 kings commanded the army and performed religious duties. The Gerousia, a council of elders over 60, advised and judged. 5 of 4s, elected annually, held executive authority and could even restrain kings. Sparta trusted no single man with absolute power, not even a king. And so Leonidas grew in a city where discipline was law, restraint was virtue, and silence was strength. He would have seen men dining together in communal messes, Syssitia, where citizens ate simple meals of barley, wine, cheese, and the infamous black broth. Luxury was distrusted. Excess was weakness. Spartans did not travel widely. They did not trade heavily. They did not write poetry like the Athenians. They trained. From a young age, boys ran barefoot along the riverbanks. They wrestled in dust. They endured cold without complaint. Speech was brief and direct, what later generations would call laconic, after Laconia itself. To speak little was to speak well. Even the landscape reinforced the lesson. Mount Taygetus loomed like a silent teacher. Its slopes were unforgiving. Its winters were bitter. The valley offered fertility, yes, but only enough. Sparta did not nurture softness, and yet, beneath this iron exterior, something else lived. Spartans believed themselves descended from Heracles, the mighty hero. They believed in fate, in oracles, in divine will. Religion permeated their discipline. Sacrifices were offered before campaigns. Omens were studied. Ritual shaped action. Strength was not chaos. It was order. Leonidas's father, King Anaxandridas II, had a complicated reign. Pressured by the ephors to produce heirs, he married twice, an unusual exception to Spartan custom. From these unions came several sons: Cleomenes, Dorieus, Leonidas, and Cleombrotus. Cleomenes, the eldest, would inherit the throne. Leonidas stood behind him, and behind Dorieus. It is possible, perhaps even likely, that Leonidas never expected power. As a third son, he would enter the agoge like any other Spartan boy. No royal exemption, no softness. In Sparta, blood mattered, but training mattered more. The agoge would shape him. It would strip him down to endurance and rebuild him as something harder. But that belongs to the next chapter. For now, picture the valley at dusk, the river quiet, the mountains turning violet beneath the setting sun. Somewhere within the low stone dwellings of Sparta, a young boy sleeps. He does not yet know the weight of bronze armor. He does not yet know the narrow path between cliff and sea called Thermopylae. He does not yet know that history will remember his name. He is simply a child of Laconia, raised by a land that demanded strength. And from that land, King Leonidas would one day rise. When King Leonidas reached the age of 7, his childhood ended. In most Greek cities, a boy of 7 still belonged to his household. He learned letters from his father, music from tutors, stories from his mother. He remained within the warmth of family life. In Sparta, he was taken away. This removal was not cruel in the eyes of his people. It was necessary. The state claimed him, as it claimed every male citizen born into Spartan blood. From that moment forward, he belonged not to comfort, not to private affection, but to discipline. This system was called the agoge. It was not simply education, it was transformation. The purpose of the agoge was clear: to create men who could endure hunger, pain, cold, and fear without complaint. Men who would stand in the phalanx without breaking. Men who would place Sparta before themselves. As a third son of King Leonidas II, Leonidas did not receive exemption. Spartan equality, at least among its citizen males, demanded shared hardship. Royal blood did not soften stone floors or fill empty stomachs. So the boy entered a new world. He was placed into an age cohort, a group of boys who would train together, sleep together, and be judged together. They were supervised by older youths and by magistrates known as paidonomoi, guardians of discipline. At first, the separation must have felt sharp. Spartan mothers were known for their severity. Later, writers would claim they told their sons to return with your shield or on it. Whether those exact words were spoken or shaped by later tradition, the sentiment was real. Affection existed, but it was quiet. Leonidas would have felt the absence of his mother's voice, yet he would not have spoken of it. Speech in Sparta was measured. Boys were trained to answer questions briefly and cleverly. To speak too much invited ridicule. Wit and restraint were praised. They learned to read and write, but only enough for necessity. Intellectual ornament was not valued as it was in Athens. Music was taught, but for rhythm in marching and unity in chorus, not for artistic ambition. The real lessons were physical. The boys ran barefoot across rough ground. They trained in wrestling, pancration, and mock combat. They learned to move as a unit, to obey instantly. Hunger was part of the design. Food was deliberately scarce. They were encouraged to steal to supplement their meals, but punished if caught. The lesson was not morality. It was cunning and survival. To endure want without complaint. To act without being seen. Winter did not halt training. They wore minimal clothing, often a single cloak throughout the year. They slept on reeds gathered from the banks of the Eurotas River, which they were required to collect with their bare hands. Hardship was not an accident. It was curriculum. By adolescence, the training intensified. Older youths were tested through ritualized beatings at the altar of Artemis Orthia, a ceremony blending religion and endurance. The aim was not merely to withstand pain, but to master it, to show no weakness before peers. We must be careful not to romanticize this. The agoge was severe. It produced resilience, yes, but also conformity. Individuality dissolved into collective identity. A Spartan man did not belong to himself. He belonged to the phalanx. Leonidas, as he grew, would have begun to understand the deeper purpose beneath the drills. Sparta's citizen population was small, perhaps never more than 8,000 to 10,000 adult males at its height. Surrounding them were far greater numbers of helots, bound to the land and resentful of their subjugation. Fear lingered beneath Spartan stability. The agoge ensured readiness. Each year, according to some sources, Ephors formally declared war on the helot population. a ritual act that allowed Spartans to kill rebellious helots without religious pollution. A secretive practice known as the cryptia may have involved young men sent into the countryside to observe and possibly eliminate potential threats. Modern historians debate the exact nature and scale of these practices. Ancient sources, especially later ones, may exaggerate. Yet the atmosphere of tension was real. Sparta lived with vigilance. Leonidas came of age within that vigilance. As a teenager, he would have been grouped into mess units, syssitia, where adult men dined together nightly. Admission required unanimous approval. Shared meals reinforced loyalty and equality. No citizen dined privately at home. Black broth, made of pork, blood, vinegar, and salt, was a staple. Foreign visitors often found it harsh. Spartans considered it strengthening. Conversation at these meals was controlled, purposeful. Boys listened more than they spoke. By 20, a Spartan male entered the ranks of the army as a full-time soldier, though he did not gain full citizenship rights until 30. Marriage could occur earlier, but domestic life remained secondary to military duty. Leonidas, still not destined for kingship, followed this path as any other. Yet something distinguished him. Perhaps it was steadiness, perhaps restraint. We know little of his personality from contemporary accounts. Herodotus, writing later in the 5th century BCE, describes his actions more than his temperament. Plutarch, centuries afterward, attributes sharp sayings and noble composure to him, though these may reflect Spartan ideal more than recorded dialogue. But even without embellished quotes, we can infer certain truths. To survive the agoge was itself proof of capability. To remain within the syssitia required the respect of peers. To rise later as a leader of 300 hand-picked men required trust. Leonidas did not become king because he sought glory. He became king because circumstance and survival placed him there. His elder brother Cleomenes would rule first. Another brother, Dorius, ambitious and restless, would leave Sparta in frustration and die attempting to found colonies abroad. Fate thinned the line. Leonidas remained. The mountains of Laconia still watched. Mount Taygetus did not change. The Eurotas still ran its narrow course. The valley still required vigilance. By the time Leonidas reached full manhood, he had known cold stone floors, empty stomachs, ritual pain, communal loyalty, and the steady rhythm of marching feet. He had been shaped not for luxury, but for endurance. He had learned that a Spartan stands not alone. He stands in line, shield beside shield, breathing in unison. He could not yet know that one day he would stand at the narrowest of gates, where mountains press close to sea. But the training had already begun for that moment. The agoge did not prepare boys for comfort. It prepared them for inevitability. And for King Leonidas, inevitability was moving quietly through history, drawing closer with each passing year. The child had been removed from his home. The youth had been hardened by discipline. The man was nearly formed. In the silence of Spartan evenings, beneath stars untroubled by city light, Leonidas would have lain awake on his reed bed, muscles aching, mind steady, unaware that centuries would remember him not for conquest, but for how he stood when retreat was possible. The agoge had done its work. Sparta had shaped its son, and soon the world beyond Laconia would test him. By the age of 20, the boy who had once slept beside the Eurotas River had become something harder. The agoge had stripped away softness. It had thinned his patience for excess. It had taught him silence, endurance, precision. Now, as a young man, Leonidas entered the next phase of Spartan life, service within the army and deeper integration into the disciplined order of the state. In Sparta, adulthood did not arrive with ceremony. It arrived with responsibility. Leonidas joined a Sicilian, a common mess of perhaps 15 men. Admission required acceptance by unanimous vote. A single rejection meant exclusion, and exclusion meant political death, for only those within a mess could claim full participation in Spartan citizen life. He was accepted. This alone suggests something essential. He was trusted. Each evening, these men gathered to eat the same simple food: barley bread, cheese, figs, wine diluted with water, and the dark, infamous broth of pork and blood. They sat not as individuals of varying wealth, but as equals under law. Even kings dined here. The Syssitia was more than a meal. It was reinforcement. Here, younger men listened to older veterans recount campaigns in the Peloponnese. Here, discipline was sharpened by shared expectation. Here, bonds formed that would one day hold a shield wall steady under pressure. For a Spartan soldier, loyalty was horizontal as much as vertical. He did not fight merely for a king, but for the man standing at his left. Leonidas learned this rhythm. By 20, he was eligible for active military service. Spartan men remained soldiers until the age of 60. Campaigns within Greece were common. Sparta frequently led coalitions against rival city-states. War was not rare disruption. It was familiar terrain. The armor of a Spartan hoplite was heavy. A bronze Corinthian helmet enclosed the head, leaving narrow slits for eyes and breath. A cuirass protected the torso. Greaves shielded the legs. But most important was the aspis, the large, round shield, curved and weighty. It covered not only the bearer, but part of the man beside him. This design was deliberate. The Spartan phalanx functioned as a single organism, 8 or more ranks deep, shields overlapping, spears projecting forward in disciplined alignment. If one man faltered, the formation weakened. Individual heroics meant little. Stability meant everything. Leonidas would have drilled in these formations repeatedly, advancing in measured step, turning on command, holding position under simulated assault, the rhythm of sandals against earth, the creak of leather straps, the breath of men moving as one. War was not chaos. It was order pressed against order. Spartan warfare valued discipline over frenzy. Unlike some Greek states that relied heavily on citizen militias raised temporarily, Sparta maintained a professional warrior class. Their reputation for steadiness was well known throughout the Hellenic world, yet this reputation carried weight. Expectation can shape a man as firmly as training. Leonidas's older brother, Cleomenes I, ruled as king from the Aegead line during these years. Cleomenes was known for ambition and occasional unpredictability. Herodotus records campaigns against Argos and involvement in Athenian politics. He also describes Cleomenes's eventual mental instability and death under grim circumstances. Whether by suicide or manipulation remains debated. Leonidas watched this unfold. He was not first in line for the throne. Dorieus, another brother, had earlier attempted to establish colonies abroad after being passed over for kingship. His ventures ended in failure and death in Sicily. Fate narrowed the royal lineage quietly. By the time Leonidas reached full maturity, Cleomenes stood as king, but without a male heir. This mattered. Sparta's dual kingship system required continuity. The Agiad and Eurypontid houses balanced one another. Stability relied on lineage as much as law. Still, Leonidas likely did not anticipate kingship in his youth. His path was that of any Spartan male. Discipline, service, marriage when permitted, continued military readiness. Marriage in Sparta was itself unusual by Greek standards. Men often married in their late 20s, yet continued living in barracks until 30. Husbands visited wives discreetly at first, preserving military focus. The arrangement prioritized the state over domestic life. Leonidas eventually married Gorgo, daughter of King Cleomenes. This union was both personal and political. Gorgo is one of the few Spartan women named in historical sources. Herodotus recounts an anecdote in which, as a child, she warned her father not to be bribed by Aristagoras of Miletus. Whether embellished or not, it suggests that she possessed intelligence and presence. Spartan women, unlike many in Greece, enjoyed relative freedom. They owned property, exercised publicly, and were educated in physical training. Their role was to bear strong children, but also to maintain households, while men remained in service. Through marriage to Gorgo, Leonidas' position within the Agiad line strengthened, and then came the shift. Around 490 BCE, Cleomenes died. Accounts differ regarding the exact circumstances. Some suggest political conflict with the Ephors. Others describe madness. Herodotus implies self-inflicted death while imprisoned. What matters is this: the throne stood vacant, and Leonidas, no longer a distant third son, became King Leonidas of Sparta. His ascent was not dramatic. There was no rebellion, no dramatic proclamation. It was succession through necessity. Yet the weight of kingship in Sparta was complex. A Spartan king did not rule as an absolute monarch. He commanded armies abroad and performed key religious duties at home. But he was constrained by the Gerousia and the Ephors. Decisions required consensus. Power was shared. Still, command in battle was his domain. Leonidas inherited not only authority, but expectation. Sparta's prestige across Greece rested partly on the perceived invincibility of its warriors. Yet the Greek world beyond Laconia was changing. In 490 BCE, the Persian Empire had attempted invasion of mainland Greece, culminating in the Battle of Marathon, where Athens and Plataea repelled the invaders. Sparta had not arrived in time to participate. Religious observance of the Carnea festival delayed their march. They came after the battle ended. This absence lingered. The Persian king Darius I did not forget defeat, and when he died, his son Xerxes inherited not only empire, but unfinished ambition. Far to the east, beyond the Aegean, a force greater than any Greek army was gathering. But in Sparta, life retained its rhythm. King Leonidas ruled within tradition. He presided over rituals. He consulted the Gerousia. He maintained the disciplined structure he himself had been shaped by. He was not flamboyant, not expansive. He was measured. The making of a Spartan man was never about spectacle. It was about steadiness, about knowing when to speak, and when silence carries more strength. By the time Leonidas reached his 40s, he had lived decades under the same code. Endurance, obedience to law, loyalty to comrades, reverence for the gods. He had trained since childhood to hold a line, and history was slowly arranging a place where holding the line would matter more than victory. For now, the valley of the Eurotas remained quiet. Mount Taygetus stood unchanged, but beyond the horizon, an empire prepared its shadow, and King Leonidas, shaped by discipline rather than destiny, would soon be called to step beyond Laconia into a story that would outlive bronze and bone. Before he was King Leonidas, he was something quieter, a man who did not expect the crown. In Sparta, expectation shaped ambition. First sons were raised beneath the shadow of inheritance. Second and third sons learned something different: patience, acceptance, a life defined not by rule, but by service. Leonidas was not born to reign. He was born behind Cleomenes, behind Dorieus. His early years would have unfolded without the looming certainty of kingship. There is a kind of freedom in that position, and also a kind of invisibility. He trained, he endured, he lived as a Spartan among Spartans. His brother Cleomenes ruled with energy and unpredictability. Herodotus records his campaigns beyond Laconia, including interference in Athenian affairs and battles against Argos. Cleomenes could be decisive, even ruthless. He operated in a Greek world increasingly tangled in alliances and rivalries. Sparta was powerful, yes, but it did not exist alone. To the north lay Corinth and Thebes. To the east, across the sea, the vast Persian Empire. Athens was rising in influence, experimenting with forms of democracy that Sparta viewed with caution. Leonidas observed this from within the disciplined stillness of his homeland. As a younger royal son, his role was not to command policy, but to uphold the system. Sparta valued continuity above innovation. Change came slowly, if at all. And yet, fate does not always honor order. Dorieus, passed over for kingship when Cleomenes ascended, chose not to remain quietly in Sparta. Ambitious and restless, he attempted to found colonies abroad, first in North Africa, then in Sicily. Both ventures ended in failure. Dorieus died far from home. The royal line narrowed. Cleomenes remained king, but without a male heir. His only known child was Gorgo, intelligent, perceptive, later wife to Leonidas himself. Marriage to Gorgo strengthened Leonidas's claim, though at the time it may have seemed simply the practical union of royal bloodlines. Spartan marriages were often strategic, but something about Gorgo's historical presence suggests that she was more than ceremonial. Herodotus attributes to her moments of insight, including a clever decoding of a hidden message warning Greece of Persian invasion. Whether embroidered by later storytelling or not, she stands in history as a rare named Spartan woman. Leonidas's marriage to her would anchor him closer to the center of power, though still not at its peak. Then came Cleomenes' decline. Ancient accounts describe political tensions, disputes with other Greek states, and eventual imprisonment by Spartan authorities. His death followed, described by Herodotus as self-inflicted in a state of madness. Modern historians debate the details. Was it truly madness? Political elimination? We cannot know with certainty. But we know this: Cleomenes died without a son, and Leonidas became king. The transition appears to have been orderly. Sparta valued procedure. The dual kingship system required stability. The Achaead throne did not remain empty long. Leonidas stepped into a role he had not been groomed to expect. He was no longer simply a Spartan soldier among others. He was King Leonidas. But kingship in Sparta was unlike monarchy elsewhere. He did not dictate law. He did not command unchecked authority. He shared power with the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, and with 5 ephors elected annually. These ephors could even bring charges against a king. Spartan governance was balanced, almost restrained. The king's greatest authority emerged in war, and war was coming. Far to the east, the Persian Empire stretched from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Aegean. It was vast beyond Greek imagination. Under Darius I, Persia had already tested mainland Greece, resulting in defeat at Marathon in 490 BCE. Though Sparta had marched to assist Athens, they arrived too late for the battle itself. The memory lingered. The Persians had not abandoned their ambition. When Darius died, his son Xerxes inherited not only the throne, but the desire to subdue Greece fully. Preparations began on a scale never before witnessed in the ancient world. Bridges over the Hellespont, canals cut through rock, armies drawn from across Asia. These events unfolded gradually, like distant thunder. In Sparta, life remained austere and steady. Religious festivals marked the calendar. Training never ceased. The Helots worked the land beneath quiet watch. But whispers reached Laconia. Envoys traveled between city-states. Alliances were discussed. The Greek world was fractious, often divided by rivalry. Yet Persia represented something different, a force external and overwhelming. King Leonidas now bore responsibility not merely for Sparta, but for its place within this growing tension. He was not a man known for flamboyant speeches. Ancient sources preserve few direct words attributed confidently to him. The famous retorts, "Come and take them," and others likely grew in retelling. They reflect Spartan spirit more than recorded dialogue. What we can say is this: he inherited a kingdom disciplined, wary, and proud. He inherited a world unsettled, and he inherited expectation. In Sparta, death in battle was honored above all. Cowardice was a stain, rarely erased. The agoge had prepared him for obedience and endurance. But kingship required judgment. How does one lead when an enemy outnumbers imagination? How does one preserve a city built on the idea of invincibility? Leonidas's reign before Thermopylae is often overshadowed by that final stand. Yet these quiet years matter. They formed the stillness before decision. He ruled during a period when Sparta balanced tradition with looming necessity. The Carnea festival, sacred to Apollo, required cessation of military action during its observance. Religious duty could delay mobilization, as it had at Marathon. For Spartans, divine order was not secondary to strategy. Faith and warfare intertwined. When Persian envoys previously demanded earth and water, symbols of submission, Sparta reportedly executed them. This act severed diplomacy entirely. Whether apocryphal or factual, it illustrates the hardened stance. Leonidas presided over a society that did not bend easily. But could it stand against empire? The valleys remained quiet. Mount Taygetus did not shift. Yet along the northern coasts of Greece, preparations began. Some city-states considered submission. Others argued resistance. Athens strengthened its navy under Themistocles. Sparta weighed its duty. And King Leonidas, once a second son without a crown, now stood at the center of decisions that would ripple through centuries. He had not chaste destiny. Destiny had narrowed toward him the discipline of his youth, the patience of his rank, the humility of being overlooked. All of it prepared him for something larger than ambition. The boy who did not expect to rule had become the man who would decide how Sparta met the greatest force the Greek world had ever seen. In the quiet courtyards of Sparta, beneath starlit skies, perhaps he walked alone at times, aware that the horizon was darkening. Power had come to him not through hunger for it, but through survival. And soon, survival itself would be tested. The second son now wore the crown, and history was drawing him toward the narrow gates of the north, before the clash of shields, before the narrow pass, before bronze met the tide of empire. There was a household. Sparta is often remembered only for its warriors, its iron discipline, its sons taken from home at 7. Yet behind every Spartan man stood a structure less often described, the quiet endurance of its women. And at the center of King Leonidas's private world stood Gorgo. She was not merely a queen by marriage. She was born into the Aegean royal house, daughter of King Cleomenes. Her presence bridged bloodlines. Through her, continuity flowed. In most Greek city-states, women lived largely unseen in public life. Their world was interior, confined to household management and child-rearing. In Sparta, the pattern was different. Spartan women trained physically. They exercised in public spaces. They owned and inherited property. They were educated, not in rhetoric or philosophy as in Athens, but in discipline, strength, and household authority. Their role was direct and unapologetic, to produce strong children and manage estates while men lived in barracks. Yet this role carried power. By the 5th century BCE, Spartan women controlled significant portions of land within Laconia, with men often absent on campaign or bound to communal living. Until 30, women maintained economic stability. Gorgo grew within this framework. Her name survives in historical record. Rare for a woman of that era. Herodotus recounts an episode from her childhood. When Aristagoras of Miletus attempted to persuade Cleomenes to support the Ionian revolt against Persia, he allegedly tried to bribe the king. It was Gorgo, still a child, who warned her father to leave before corruption took hold. Whether embellished or not, the story reveals how later Greeks remembered her. Perceptive, politically aware. When Leonidas married Gorgo, the union strengthened his position within the royal line. It also joined 2 individuals raised within the same austere code. Spartan marriage customs were unlike those elsewhere in Greece. A bride's head was sometimes shaved. She wore a cloak and sandals. The husband would symbolically capture her, carrying her to a prepared space. Such rituals likely echoed older traditions of union through strength. Yet after marriage, the husband often returned to the barracks. Domestic life did not override military obligation. Leonidas, even as king, remained bound to the structure of communal discipline. Still, within that structure, there was private life. There would have been quiet conversations in courtyards, shared glances during religious festivals, moments of stillness beyond public duty. We must imagine carefully, not romantically, but gently. Spartan affection was restrained, yet not absent. From their marriage came a son, Pleistarchus. He would be too young to rule when his father died, but his existence mattered. Bloodlines secured continuity. In Sparta, kingship was hereditary, yet never absolute. The presence of an heir ensured stability within the Aegeid house. Gorgo's role during Leonidas's reign is not extensively detailed in surviving sources, but her later life as widow of Thermopylae suggests endurance. She lived on after his death, and her son would eventually rule with a regent during his minority. Marriage in Sparta was not spectacle, it was continuity, and continuity was strength. Beyond household matters, Leonidas's kingship involved ritual obligations. Spartan kings served as priests of Zeus Lacedaemon and Zeus Uranios. They performed sacrifices before campaigns. They interpreted omens. Religion permeated decision-making. Sparta did not separate the divine from the political. Oracles, particularly from Delphi, held significant weight. The Pythia's pronouncements shaped choices across Greece. Before major military action, consultation was common. As Persia's preparations intensified under Xerxes, Greek states sought guidance from Delphi. The oracle's response to Sparta would later echo through history. Either Sparta would fall, or a king of Heracles' line would die. Such pronouncements were ambiguous, yet heavy. Leonidas, descendant by tradition from Heracles, would have heard these words not as poetry, but as possibility. Within the quiet of his home, beneath Laconian stars, perhaps such prophecy lingered. Yet daily life continued. The Syssitia met each evening. Young boys entered the agoge as Leonidas once had. Helots worked the land. Ephors debated policy. The Persian threat did not arrive overnight. It gathered. Athens invested in naval expansion under Themistocles. Corinth strengthened defenses. Some city-states considered submission to avoid destruction. Sparta weighed its responsibility. As hegemon of the Peloponnesian League, Sparta often led alliances of southern Greek states. Its military reputation lent authority, yet leadership required choice. Leonidas was not known for grand speeches preserved in record. His strength lay in steadiness. A king shaped by the agoge does not rush toward drama. He waits, he observes, he endures. Marriage anchored him. Fatherhood deepened responsibility. The crown demanded judgment. And beyond the mountains of Laconia, Xerxes assembled an army drawn from across Asia. Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Phoenicians, and more. Ancient numbers reported by Herodotus reach into the millions, though modern scholars suggest far fewer, perhaps in the hundreds of thousands. Even so, the scale dwarfed Greek forces. When news of Xerxes' advance became undeniable, Greek city-states convened at Corinth to discuss unified resistance. Old rivalries softened under common threat. Sparta was expected to lead on land, and at the center of that expectation stood King Leonidas. But before marching north, he was still husband, still father, still a man shaped by quiet evenings and disciplined mornings. History often compresses individuals into moments. Thermopylae overshadows everything before it. Yet those final days were built upon decades of formation and upon the stability of home. When the time came for decision, Leonidas would leave behind not merely a city, but a wife, a son, a lineage. Spartan mothers were said to encourage bravery without tears. Spartan wives understood absence. Gorgo would have known the weight of what approached. And in that knowledge, there would have been no dramatic farewell, only acceptance. For Sparta did not celebrate long goodbyes. It valued resolve. The household of King Leonidas was not adorned with luxury. It did not glitter with excess, but within its simplicity lay something enduring, a shared understanding that duty surpassed comfort. Marriage, in this world, was not escape from hardship. It was partnership within it. And soon, that partnership would face its severest test. For the oracle had spoken. Empire was moving. And the quiet strength built within household walls would steady King Leonidas when he stepped beyond them, toward the narrow pass where legend waits, far from the valleys of Laconia, beyond the Aegean Sea, past the islands scattered like stepping stones between continents. An empire was gathering its weight. While Sparta kept its rhythms of discipline and ritual, the Persian Empire moved with vast, deliberate momentum. It stretched across 3 continents, from the Indus Valley in the east, through Mesopotamia and Anatolia, to the shores of the Mediterranean. It was unlike anything the Greek world had known. Under Darius I, Persia had already attempted to subdue mainland Greece. The campaign ended in defeat at Marathon in 490 BCE, where Athenian hoplites repelled Persian forces against heavy odds. That loss was not forgotten. When Darius died, his son ascended the throne. Xerxes I inherited not only a vast dominion, but unfinished ambition. Unlike the city-states of Greece, Persia was unified under a single monarch. Its administrative system divided territories into satrapies, governed by appointed officials. Tribute flowed steadily toward the imperial center. Roads connected distant provinces. Communication moved efficiently. Persia did not rush. It prepared. Xerxes spent years assembling what would become one of the largest military expeditions of the ancient world. Armies were drawn from across the empire. Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, Phoenicians, Lydians, and many more. Each brought distinct armor, weapons, languages. Herodotus famously describes numbers reaching into the millions, though modern historians suggest these figures were likely exaggerated. Even reduced estimates place the force at perhaps 100,000 to 200,000 soldiers, accompanied by a vast fleet. For Greece, divided, comparatively small, the scale was overwhelming. Engineering accompanied ambition. To move his army into Europe, Xerxes ordered bridges constructed across the Hellespont. When an early attempt failed due to storms, he reportedly commanded the waters to be scourged and chained, a symbolic act demonstrating imperial authority over nature itself. A canal was cut through the Athos Peninsula to avoid treacherous seas. These were not impulsive gestures. They were statements. Persia was coming, not as a raid, but as an inevitability. In Sparta, word traveled gradually. Envoys from northern Greece brought news. Some city-states chose submission, offering earth and water as tokens of loyalty to Xerxes. Others resisted. Fear moved through the Hellenic world in quiet waves. Athens, under the influence of Themistocles, had already invested heavily in naval expansion. Silver from the Laurian mines funded triremes. Athens prepared for sea warfare. Sparta, land power of the Peloponnese, faced a different question. Where could such a massive force be stopped? Geography became strategy. northern Greece offered narrow passes where numbers mattered less. One such location lay between steep mountains and the Malian Gulf, a place called Thermopylae. The name meant hot gates for its nearby sulfurous springs. It was not wide. In some places, the pass narrowed significantly, allowing only limited frontage for advancing troops. Here, the vast Persian army could be funneled. Here, the phalanx might hold. But timing mattered. The Persian advance was steady. Xerxes moved methodically through Thrace and Macedonia. Many Greek states north of central Greece submitted without resistance. A congress of Greek city-states met at Corinth to coordinate defense. Old rivalries simmered beneath forced unity. Athens and Sparta did not naturally trust one another, yet necessity pressed them together. Sparta was asked to lead the land defense. King Leonidas now stood at the intersection of destiny and duty. Yet obstacles remained. The Carneia festival approached, a sacred observance honoring Apollo. During this time, Spartan law forbade military campaigns. Religious law was not easily dismissed. At Marathon, such observance had delayed Spartan assistance. Could they ignore the gods? Simultaneously, the Olympic Games were being held, another sacred truce period. The tension between religious devotion and military urgency weighed heavily. According to Herodotus, when Sparta consulted the oracle at Delphi regarding Persia's invasion, the Pythia delivered a stark prophecy. Either Sparta would be destroyed, or one of her kings, descended from Heracles, must die. Such pronouncements were characteristic, layered, conditional. Yet their meaning felt clear. King Leonidas, as descendant of Heracles through the Aegean line, understood the implication. The Persian shadow was no longer distant. It had crossed into Europe. Villages burned in its path. Supplies were requisitioned. Resistance was crushed. The Greek fleet positioned itself at Artemisium to coordinate with the land forces. The plan required synchronization. If Thermopylae fell quickly, the fleet would be exposed. Every decision carried consequence. Leonidas chose to move north with an advance guard rather than the full Spartan army. Officially, this was framed as a vanguard, with larger forces to follow after religious observances concluded. He selected 300 Spartan hoplites, not randomly. Each man chosen had a living son to carry on his name. This detail, recorded by Herodotus, is striking. It suggests awareness, perhaps even acceptance, that the mission carried extraordinary risk. But the Spartans did not march alone. Allied contingents joined: Thespians, Thebans, Corinthians, Phocians, and others. The total Greek force at Thermopylae likely numbered between 6,000 and 7,000 initially, still vastly outnumbered. Yet geography offered hope. The pass would narrow the Persian advance. The sea would limit flanking maneuvers. Coordinated with the Greek fleet, Sparta did not send its entire army. This decision has been debated for centuries. Was it religious obligation, political caution, underestimation of Persian speed? Perhaps all of these. Leonidas, however, moved forward with clarity. He did not march with grand spectacle. Spartan processions were austere, armor polished but unadorned, shields bearing the lambda, symbol of Laconia. As he left Sparta, he would have passed Mount Taygetus one last time, the valley of his childhood behind him. Gorgo remained. His son remained. Sparta remained. Ahead lay Thermopylae. Behind him moved history, The Persian army advanced southward with confidence. Xerxes believed that sheer scale would crush resistance. Many advisors likely expected Greek submission once confronted with imperial magnitude. But Greece was not a single kingdom. It was a tapestry of fiercely independent polis, argumentative, divided, yet stubborn. Sparta's reputation alone carried psychological weight. When Xerxes learned that Spartans stood at Thermopylae, he reportedly waited several days, expecting them to retreat. They did not. From the Persian perspective, this must have seemed irrational. From the Spartan perspective, it was inevitable. The shadow of Persia stretched long across the land, but within the narrow gate between mountain and sea, a small force prepared to test whether discipline could withstand empire. King Leonidas did not seek annihilation. He sought delay. Time for the Greek world to organize. Time for unity to solidify. Time for fleets to maneuver. The Persian shadow rose higher each day. Yet in its path stood a man shaped from childhood to endure pressure without complaint. A man who understood that sometimes survival does not mean living, but holding long enough for others to stand. The empire approached. The gates awaited. And the next chapter of King Leonidas's life would unfold not in the quiet courtyards of Sparta, but beneath the sun-scorched cliffs of Thermopylae. In the days before King Leonidas marched north, Sparta did what it always did when the world trembled. It consulted tradition. It listened to law. It watched the sky for signs. Sparta did not make decisions the way Athens did, with loud debate in open assemblies and persuasion shaped by rhetoric. Sparta was quieter, more layered. Decisions emerged from councils, from ritual obligations, from the slow weight of precedent. And in the center of those decisions stood a difficult truth. Persia was coming, whether Sparta wished it or not. Yet to act too quickly could mean violating the gods. To act too slowly could mean losing Greece. Sparta's government was never the will of one man, even if that man wore a crown. King Leonidas shared authority with the Gerousia, the council of elders, men over 60 who carried the memory of past wars and past disasters. Alongside them stood the ephors, 5 officials elected each year, powerful enough to restrain kings, direct policy, and control what Sparta did and did not do. So when news of Xerxes' advance became unavoidable, it did not become a single decision. It became a tension within the whole Spartan system. Religious observance pressed from one side. Strategic urgency pressed from the other. And under both pressures, the city attempted to remain itself, controlled, disciplined, obedient to law. The sacred calendar mattered in Sparta. The Carnea, a festival in honor of Apollo Carneos, was not a simple celebration. It was a binding obligation, tied to identity, tied to the favor of the gods. During its observance, Spartan military campaigns were restricted. To ignore this was to risk divine anger, and Spartans feared the gods in a steady, practical way, not with dramatic panic, but with deep respect for the unseen order that governed all things. At the same time, the wider Greek world looked to Sparta as a pillar. Athens was preparing ships. Corinth and other Peloponnesian states looked toward Spartan leadership on land. The allies did not ask whether Sparta was in a festival season. They asked whether Sparta would stand. In this atmosphere, the oracle at Delphi loomed large. Sparta, like many Greek city-states, sought guidance from Delphi in times of crisis. The Pythia's words were rarely plain. They came as riddles, as layered warnings. But the message that reached Sparta, preserved by Herodotus, cut through ambiguity with unusual sharpness. Either Sparta would fall, or a king of Heracles' line would die. It was not a comforting prophecy. It was a fork in the road. For King Leonidas, the meaning was personal. The Agiad line traced its legendary ancestry back to Heracles. Kings were not merely political leaders. They were living symbols of divine descent and civic continuity. To hear that a king must die, or Sparta must be destroyed, was to feel the walls of fate close in. Yet even prophecy did not simply dictate action. Sparta did not rush. The ephors and elders would have debated the scope of response, the timing, the acceptable breach of religious restriction, the risk of leaving the Peloponnese exposed. They also feared something closer than Persia. They feared the Helots. To send the full Spartan army far north was to reduce control at home. The Helots outnumbered Spartan citizens dramatically. The stability of Sparta depended on constant readiness to suppress revolt. Sparta could not simply empty itself of soldiers and trust that everything would remain quiet in Laconia. So the decision formed slowly, like a spearhead hammered into shape. A limited force would go first, a vanguard, a statement, a delay. King Leonidas would lead it, and the 300 Spartans he chose were not chosen lightly. These men were drawn from the citizen elite, full Spartiate hoplites, trained from childhood, disciplined in the phalanx, hardened in body and in mind. But there was a detail, preserved in tradition, that suggests the psychological weight of the mission. Each of the 300 had a living son, not because Sparta valued sentiment, but because Sparta valued continuity. A man who dies without an heir leaves a break in a line. Multiply that break across 300 families, and you weaken the citizen body, which was already small. So the selection carried a quiet recognition. The odds were grim, not hopeless perhaps, but grim. And King Leonidas, in accepting command, accepted that reality without ceremony. This was not a theatrical sacrifice staged for legend. It was strategic courage mixed with necessity. The aim was not to win in the simple sense. It was to hold, to delay Xerxes long enough for Greek allies to prepare, to keep the Greek fleet coordinated at Artemisium, to slow the Persian advance until larger forces could gather. Thermopylae was chosen for its shape, a narrow pass squeezed between mountains and sea, where an enormous army could not easily deploy its numbers, where Persian cavalry would be less useful, where a disciplined hoplite wall could endure. And endurance, Sparta's core virtue, was exactly what this place demanded. In the days leading to departure, Sparta would have remained outwardly calm. That is what Sparta did best, wearing calm like armor. Men continued training. Messes met at evening. The city did not erupt in public grief or public celebration. There may have been prayers and sacrifices. There would certainly have been omens read, offerings made, ritual preparations. King Leonidas, as king, would have stood in the center of these rites. Sacrifice before war was not optional. It was alignment, a way of stepping into violence without spiritual disorder. And in his private world, there may have been a moment of stillness, a moment with Gorgo, a look at his son, a recognition that what lay ahead might not allow return. Spartan farewells were not known for tears, but silence can be heavy. A king does not need to speak his fear for it to exist. The morning of departure would have felt like many Spartan mornings. Cool air, pale light, the scent of earth and river, men gathering with their shields and spears, cloaks draped, armor strapped, sandals tightened. No one needed to be told what was at stake. They knew, and yet they moved forward. Because in Sparta, duty was not an emotion. It was a structure you stepped into, the way you stepped into a formation. King Leonidas did not march as a man chasing immortality. He marched as a Spartan, doing what Spartans believed they were made to do. Stand where standing mattered. Behind him, the city remained, quiet, watchful, disciplined. Ahead of him, the road stretched north through the Peloponnese, toward central Greece, toward the place where the land narrows and the sea presses close, toward the hot gates. This was the decision at Sparta. Not a dramatic vow shouted under banners, but a measured commitment shaped by law, ritual, strategy, and the cold clarity of geography. Persia was coming. Sparta could not hide behind festivals forever, so it sent a king and 300 men with sons, and with them, the unspoken understanding that sometimes the purpose of a battle is not to survive it, but to buy time for others to survive what comes next. They were not chosen for spectacle. They were chosen for reliability. When later generations spoke of the 300, the number became a symbol. Clean, sharp, easy to remember. It turned into a kind of stone carving in the mind. But to King Leonidas and to Sparta, these were not symbols at first. They were men. Men with names that once belonged to living families. Men with sons at home. Men who had eaten in mess halls, trained in dust, marched in step, and learned through a lifetime of discipline that the shield wall is only as strong as its least steady heart. In Sparta, selection was never sentimental. It was practical. A small force could move quickly. A small force could arrive at the pass before Xerxes' army rolled south like a tide. A small force could also act as a signal to the rest of Greece. Sparta was present. Sparta was committed. Sparta would not vanish behind ritual and hesitation. But why 300? Sparta's kings had a bodyguard unit known as the Hippes. Not cavalry, despite the name, but an elite group of 300 hoplites who served as a king's guard in war. These men were often selected by merit and reputation. It is possible that King Leonidas's 300 were drawn from this tradition. Experienced, trusted, disciplined. And there was another detail, remembered because it feels so human beneath the hardness. Each man chosen had a living son. This is not the kind of detail that grows from pure legend. It is too administrative, too practical. It speaks of a society that counted its citizen bodies carefully, because it had to. Sparta did not have endless reserves of full citizens. Its Spartiate class was small and shrinking even before Thermopylae. Sending 300 men with no heirs would mean sending 300 family lines into extinction. So the selection carried two meanings at once. First, these men were the finest. Second, their families would continue even if they did not return. This did not lessen risk. It simply prevented collapse. In the days before departure, King Leonidas would have moved among them without theatrical distance. Spartan kings ate in common messes. They trained within the same system. Their authority was real, but it was not wrapped in luxury. There were no jeweled courts, no perfumed halls. There was only the discipline of the state and the simplicity of preparation. Each man would have checked the straps of his armor, the fit of his greaves, the edge of his spearhead, the worn grip of his shield. The shield was everything, not because it protected the bearer best, but because it protected the formation. A Spartan's greatest shame was not losing his spear or sword. Those could break, could be dropped, could be replaced. But the shield was different. To throw it away was to abandon the man beside you. It was to tear a hole in the wall. So they carried it like a responsibility, not an accessory. The red cloaks associated with Spartans were practical too, dyed crimson, so blood would be less visible, so injuries would not weaken morale, so fear would not spread. Even color was discipline. When they finally began to march, the road out of Laconia was long and steady. They moved north through the Peloponnese, toward the Isthmus of Corinth, toward central Greece, where the land begins to tighten into passes and ridges. The landscape changed gradually. The broad valley of Sparta fell behind them. The mountains shifted. The air became different, less familiar, more open. The sense of leaving home deepened with each day's step, and they were not alone. This is often forgotten because the number 300 stands so brightly. But Leonidas did not intend to hold Thermopylae with Spartans alone. As he marched, other Greeks joined him. Men from Tegea, Mantinea, and Arcadian cities. Forces from Corinth and Phlius and Mycenae. Phocians, Locrians, the Thespians, whose courage would later be equal to the Spartans and far less celebrated. The Thebans, sent under complicated circumstances that may have involved political pressure within their own city. Altogether, when the Greeks reached Thermopylae, the force was likely several thousand, still tiny compared with Persia, but no longer just 300. And yet, those 300 were the spine of the resolve, because Sparta's presence mattered beyond numbers. Sparta was an idea in Greece. Steadiness, discipline, refusal. To stand beside Spartans was to feel less alone. To see a Spartan king in the front rank was to feel that the gods had not abandoned the Greeks entirely. There is an image Herodotus preserves, quiet, almost strange in its simplicity. As the Persian army approached, Xerxes reportedly sent scouts to observe the Greek camp. The scouts returned with something unexpected. They saw Spartans, not panicking, not praying in terror, but combing their hair, exercising, moving calmly. If the story is true, it is not evidence of arrogance. It is evidence of training so deep that the body returns to routine even when the mind faces the impossible. Combing hair in Sparta had meaning. It was associated with preparation, a ritual of readiness, an act of composure in the face of overwhelming force. Composure becomes a weapon. It unsettles an enemy. It steadies allies. It tells the world, we have already accepted the outcome, and we will not be moved by fear. King Leonidas would have understood the psychological power of this. He did not need speeches. The body itself could speak. The posture, the calm, the routine. These were messages more convincing than words. When the Greeks reached Thermopylae, they met the place itself, a narrow corridor pressed between steep slopes and sea, with hot springs nearby. the air sometimes carrying a faint mineral scent. The road through the pass was constricted. In some places, the width allowed only a small frontage of men. Here, Persia's numbers would not flood freely. Here, the phalanx could become a gate. They began to reinforce positions. They repaired a low wall, an older structure that could help anchor defense. They placed contingents in roles suited to the terrain. The Phocians were positioned to guard a mountain path. An alternate route would be used to outflank the main defense. It was a good plan, as far as any plan could be good against an empire. But even the best plan depends on what cannot be controlled. Weather, fatigue, fear, betrayal. Still, for the moment, all was focused. The men slept under the open sky or in crude shelters. They ate simple rations. They kept weapons close. They watched the horizon. Somewhere not far away, the Persian host approached. Dust in the distance, the murmur of thousands upon thousands of feet. To stand there, facing that approaching mass, required a particular kind of mind. Not reckless, not blind, but disciplined enough to place purpose above survival. The 300 had been trained since childhood to obey, to endure, to hold. Now the world asked them to do it at a scale beyond imagination. And King Leonidas stood among them not as a distant figure, but as the same kind of man, shaped by the same agoge, the same mess halls, the same iron law. His kingship did not lift him above Spartan life. It concentrated it. He carried the crown, yes, but also the same understanding every Spartan carried. A man's life is short. A city's survival is longer. Honor is not something spoken. It is something done. As night fell at Thermopylae, the sea would have darkened to ink. The cliffs would have turned into black silhouettes against a starlit sky. The hot springs would have steamed faintly. Some men would have slept. Some would have remained awake, listening. Not to music, not to comfort, but to distance, measuring it by sound, by intuition, by the tiny changes in air that come when something immense draws near. And in those hours, the meaning of 300 became more than a number. It became a decision made flesh, a decision that said, even if the world is larger than us, we will not behave as if we are small. We will stand where the land narrows. We will hold the gate. We will force the empire to come through us, one breath at a time. This was not yet the battle, but it was the moment before it, when the mind settles, and fear is either mastered or allowed to grow. The 300 were chosen because Sparta believed they had mastered fear. And now, beneath the cliffs of Thermopylae, King Leonidas waited for the first wave of Persia to test whether that belief was true. The road to Thermopylae was not a single road. It was a slow unfolding of distance, measured in days, in aching calves, in the steady rhythm of sandals on earth. It was the gradual feeling of leaving one world and approaching another. For King Leonidas, every mile north was a movement away from the deep familiarity of Laconia and toward a place that belonged to no one, not truly. Thermopylae was not a city. It was a threshold, a narrow seam in the land where mountains came down hard toward the sea, where the coast tightened into a corridor, where the wind carried salt and mineral scent from the hot springs that gave the place its name. But before that corridor could be seen, it had to be reached. The march north would have cut through the Peloponnese like a slow procession of purpose. The men moved with their packs and shields, with spears carried upright, like thin trees. they were joined by allies along the way. Different dialects, different accents, different customs, yet all walking toward the same narrowing point. In calmer times, Greeks traveled as merchants, athletes, pilgrims. This was not that. This was the sound of armor shifting under cloth. This was the soft clink of bronze against bronze. This was the quiet discipline of men who did not waste breath. At night, when the marching ended, the camps would have formed in simple patterns. Fires kept low, food eaten without excess, watch rotations arranged with practiced order. There is a particular quiet that settles over a military camp at night. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of focus. Some men sleep quickly, as if sleep is a tool. Others sleep lightly, waking at each change in wind, each unfamiliar bird call. And then there are those who lie awake without rest, because the mind insists on measuring what is coming. King Leonidas would have known this kind of night. He had lived inside discipline since he was 7. Yet even discipline does not erase thought. As they moved northward, the Greek world around them shifted. In southern Greece, Sparta's authority was clear. Many Peloponnesian cities followed Spartan leadership through alliance and long habit. But in central Greece, loyalties became more uncertain. Some communities feared Persia so deeply that submission felt safer than resistance. Others argued that submission was merely a slower kind of destruction, one that erased freedom in exchange for temporary survival. Fear can turn people against each other. Fear can also bind them. This time, it did both. The closer Leonidas came to Thermopylae, the more the land itself seemed to take on meaning. The mountains began to feel less like scenery and more like walls. The coastline became more constrained. Rivers and marshlands shaped where men could walk and where armies could move. Geography was no longer background. It was the battlefield forming in advance. Thermopylae had always been a pass of consequence. Armies and travelers moving between northern and southern Greece passed through it because there were few easy alternatives. The mountains above were rugged. The coastal ground could be treacherous, and in that era, the sea came closer to the cliffs than it does today. The pass was narrower then, more severe, more like a gate. This narrowness was the entire strategy. If a Greek force could hold Thermopylae, Xerxes could not simply flow south into Greece like water. He would be forced to fight on ground that denied him his greatest advantage, numbers. But choosing a place to stand is one thing. Holding it is another. And so the road to Thermopylae was also a road into uncertainty. As Leonidas approached, messages and rumors would have traveled in both directions. Some spoke of Persian engineering, bridges over the Hellespont, canals cut through rock. Some spoke of the vast fleet shadowing the coastline. Some repeated the old story of Marathon, as if memory could become armor. Men always do this before catastrophe. They reach for stories that end in survival. They repeat them like prayers. And above all those stories, there was the truth that could not be spoken too loudly. Marathon had been a victory, yes, but Marathon had not been the full weight of Persia. This time, Persia was coming with a king, and with the intention not to punish, but to conquer. When the Greeks finally arrived at Thermopylae, the place greeted them with a kind of stark simplicity. The cliffs rose steep and close. The sea was there, always present. its surface sometimes calm, sometimes restless, depending on wind and tide. Hot springs steamed faintly. Minerals stained rocks. The air could carry a strange, bitter scent. It did not feel like a place where men should die. It felt like a place where the earth itself was exposed. Bare, narrow, and honest. The Greeks began to shape their defense. They repaired an old wall near the narrowest point, a low barrier that could anchor the line. They chose where to place different contingents. They arranged themselves with the understanding that not all allies fought the same way or held the same discipline. The Spartans would form the core, not because they were magically invincible, but because their training made them steady under pressure. Steadiness is rare, and at Thermopylae, steadiness was worth more than numbers. The Phocians were assigned to guard a mountain path above the pass, an alternate route through the hills known to locals. This path could allow an enemy to bypass the main defense. The decision to guard it was wise, yet it also revealed the fragile truth. Even at a perfect choke point, there's always a way around if someone knows the land well enough. So the Greeks watched the cliffs as much as they watched the road. They waited. Waiting before battle has its own weight. Time stretches. Minutes become long. The mind tries to fill the silence with imagined sounds. Marching, shouting, the thunder of approaching feet. But the horizon does not always reveal what is coming right away. Sometimes the enemy is still far enough away that you only sense them through subtle changes, the movement of birds, the faint haze of dust, the taste of metal in your mouth that comes from nerves. In those days, Xerxes did not immediately attack. According to Herodotus, he waited. Perhaps he expected the Greeks to flee when they saw the size of his host. Perhaps he wanted to offer them a chance to submit. Or perhaps he simply enjoyed the slow pressure of inevitability, the knowledge that he could afford patience while the Greeks could not. For the men at Thermopylae, this waiting was another kind of test. It is one thing to fight. It is another thing to stand in place and listen to your own thoughts while you know what is coming. The camp would have been full of small details, the quiet mechanics of readiness, men checking spear points, men tightening straps, men rubbing oil into muscles, men speaking softly in small clusters, or not speaking at all. The Spartans, in particular, would have kept their routines. Exercise in the morning, calm movement, composure. And yes, if Herodotus's report is true, some would have combed their hair, as if preparing not for death, but for ceremony. Not vanity. Readiness. A signal to themselves and to the world that fear would not be allowed to reshape them. King Leonidas stood among these preparations as a figure both ordinary and immense. Ordinary, because Spartan kings were not distant from their men. Immense, because he carried the weight of decision. Behind him lay Sparta, his wife, his son, the city that had shaped him. Ahead lay the Persian tide. Between them lay this narrow strip of land, this hot gate where the world would soon press inward. As evening fell, the sun would have turned the cliffs a deep, warm color, gold shifting into copper, copper fading into shadow. The sea would have darkened. The hot springs would have steamed in the cooling air. And somewhere beyond the visible distance, the Persian host encamped too, so vast that its fires might have looked like a second sky. The road had ended. The gate had been reached. Now there was only the line, only the narrow ground, only the waiting. And soon, very soon, the sound of Persia would roll into the pass like thunder. Morning at Thermopylae arrived with no ceremony. The light came the way it always came, slowly, pale at first, then brighter, spreading across the cliffs and catching the surface of the sea until it glittered. The hot springs still breathed their faint steam. The narrow road through the pass still lay quiet, yet nothing was truly quiet anymore. Somewhere beyond the bend of land, beyond the line of sight, the Persian army had woken too. A vast host does not rise silently. Even at a distance, it changes the world. It puts weight into the air. It makes the ground feel less stable, as if the earth itself is bracing. For the Greeks, and for King Leonidas, this day was not about surprise. It was about inevitability. Herodotus tells us Xerxes waited several days after arriving, expecting the Greeks to withdraw. Perhaps he believed no one would stand when confronted with so much power. Perhaps he believed the sight of his army would be enough to open the gate. But the Greeks did not retreat. They stayed. They repaired their wall. They stood in formation. And so, the waiting ended. When Xerxes finally ordered the attack, it began like many decisions in empire, not with rage, but with assumption. He believed his men could simply push through. He believed numbers would do what courage could not. The Persians advanced into the pass. From the Greek side, the first sight of them would have been a moving pattern, rows of men in different armor, carrying bows, spears, light shields. Some wore woven caps or soft headgear rather than heavy bronze helmets. Their style of warfare, across much of the Persian infantry, favored mobility and missile fire. They were part of an imperial system built on variety. Many peoples, many weapons, one command. Against them stood a different kind of force. Greek hoplites were heavy infantry, bronze and wood, large shields, spears, tight formations. They were built for collision. When the Persians entered the narrow way, they entered the place where collision mattered more than movement. King Leonidas placed the Spartans at the heart of the line, with allies beside and behind. The formation was layered, ordered. The repaired wall anchored them. The cliffs and the sea held the edges. This was what Sparta had come for, to make the enemy fight on Spartan terms. At first contact, the world became sound and pressure. Spears met shields with a sharp knock. Bronze rang. Men shouted, some in Greek, some in languages carried from far provinces. The air filled with dust and breath. Persian arrows, where they could be loosed effectively, rattled against bronze and wood. Some found gaps, some struck faces and throats. But the Greek shields were broad, and the armor was heavy. Then the hoplite wall pushed forward. Not a sprint, not a reckless surge. A measured advance, step, brace, thrust. The spear was the main weapon. A Greek hoplite did not need to swing wildly. He needed to hold position and deliver force in small, decisive movements. The second and third ranks behind him extended their spears over his shoulder. The whole line became a forest of points. In a wide field, the Persians might have used numbers to wrap around. At Thermopylae, the pass denied them that. Wave after wave came, and wave after wave broke. Herodotus describes the Persians suffering heavy losses, and he emphasizes something important. The Spartans and their allies did did not simply stand in one place like a stone wall. They used tactics within the narrowness. They advanced, they withdrew. They feigned retreat to draw Persians forward, then turned and struck while the enemy formation loosened. This was discipline in motion. To feign retreat without panic takes training. It takes trust that the man beside you will turn when you turn, not run when you run. The Persians pressed forward again. Their officers drove them on. Xerxes, according to Herodotus, watched and rose from his throne in alarm more than once as he saw his men pushed back. And yet the Persians kept coming, because that is what armies do when commanded by kings. At some point, Xerxes sent in his elite troops, those often called the Immortals in Greek sources, a force associated with Persian prestige. Their arrival carried expectation. Surely, these would succeed where others failed. But even elite troops cannot change the shape of land. Even reputation cannot widen a pass. The Immortals advanced, perhaps more heavily armed than the first waves, perhaps more disciplined. Yet the Greek line held. The hoplites' heavy shields locked. Their spears found targets. Their armor absorbed glancing blows. The pass became a grinding place, a narrow corridor filled with bodies, sweat, and iron. For the Greeks, this was not glorious. It was exhausting. A phalanx fight is intimate. You feel the shove through your shield. You taste dust. You hear a man behind you breathing hard. You smell blood and salt and hot stone warmed by sun. And you keep your feet. Because if you fall, someone else falls. Because if the line breaks, there is nowhere to run. Behind you are your allies. Beyond them, your homeland. King Leonidas fought within this pressure not as a distant commander, but as a Spartan king, close enough that his presence mattered. In such a tight battle, leadership is not only orders shouted from the rear, it is example. It is steadiness. It is the king standing where he can be seen, where fear cannot pretend to be private. The first day wore on. Persian losses mounted. Greek losses came too, but the line held. By the end of that first clash, something had shifted, not in numbers, but in belief. The Persians had believed the Greeks would crumble quickly. They did not. The Greeks had feared that the Persian army was unstoppable. It was not unstoppable here. Thermopylae was proving the logic of the plan. The narrow gate worked. And yet, beneath that victory, there was always the quiet awareness of scale. Xerxes could lose thousands and still have thousands more. The Greeks could not trade lives so freely. Every death on the Greek side mattered more. So when evening came and the fighting eased, the camp would have felt strange, relieved, but not restful. Men tended wounds. They drank water. They ate what they could. They repaired damaged shields. They retrieved spears. They burned the dead, if possible, or laid them aside with a kind of exhausted reverence. The sea continued to move as it always moved. The cliffs continued to stand. The hot springs continued to steam. But the air now carried the day's work, the scent of sweat, the sharpness of blood, the lingering metallic tang that clings to battlefields. King Leonidas would have looked upon his men, Spartans and allies alike, and understood that the first clash had achieved what it was meant to achieve. It had delayed Xerxes. It had proved that the Persian army could be held, and it had sent a message outward into Greece. The gate still stands. But he also would have understood something else, something that lives beneath all successful defenses. The enemy learns. Each failed wave teaches the attacker. Each day that passes increases the chance that another route will be found, another tactic attempted, another weakness discovered. Thermopylae was a narrow place, and narrow places can be held until they cannot. That night, the Greeks slept in shifts. Some slept deeply from exhaustion, as if the body had shut down to save itself. Others slept lightly, waking at every sound. The sea wind moved through the pass. Torches flickered in the Persian camp. Far larger and louder, Xerxes would have been considering what he had not expected to need: patience, adaptation, and perhaps a way around. The first clash had ended. The gate had held. And in the quiet after battle, with the stars returning to the sky, King Leonidas prepared for the truth that every soldier learns. Tomorrow is not the same as today. Tomorrow, the empire will try again. The second day at Thermopylae began the way the first had ended, quietly. Not peaceful, not safe, but quiet in the sense that men had learned to hold their thoughts inside themselves, like coals covered in ash. The air was cooler in the early hours, carrying the salt of the sea and the faint mineral breath of the hot springs. Somewhere above the pass, birds called from the rocks. Somewhere beyond the bend, the Persian host shifted and prepared. For the Greeks, the narrowness of the land was still their strongest ally. It was easy, later, to imagine Thermopylae as a single tight doorway where only a few men could stand at once. In truth, the pass was not one simple pinch point. It widened and narrowed in sections. It had places where formations could breathe and places where they could not. But always, it denied the Persians the freedom of open field. Always, it forced the fight to become close. And close fighting favors those who are trained to stand close. King Leonidas rose before the day warmed fully. The habits of Sparta did not vanish on campaign. Routine was a kind of protection. It kept the mind from drifting into dread. Men checked their equipment again. Leather straps were retied. Broken spear shafts were replaced. The edges of blades were felt with thumb and careful attention. Wounds were bound as tightly as they could be. Men who had bled the day before still stood in line, because leaving the line was not simply stepping away from danger. It was leaving a hole. In the Greek camp, the mood was not celebration. It was steadiness. Victory on the first day had proven something valuable. Persia could be held here, but no one believed the war was won. They could feel, in the way armies can feel, that the true test was endurance. How long can you hold a gate when the enemy has more men than you can count? How long can you keep your arms from trembling, your legs from stiffening, your breath from turning into panic? There is a particular fatigue that comes from holding position under repeated assault. It is not the fatigue of marching, where distance changes and scenery shifts. It is the fatigue of sameness, of the same narrow space, the same weight of the shield, the same shove of bodies, the same sound of impact. Again and again. On the Persian side, frustration must have grown like heat. Xerxes had not crossed continents to be stalled by a few thousand men in a rocky pass. His empire was built on the idea that resistance was temporary and submission was inevitable. His power was meant to feel like gravity, something you do not fight, only accept. Yet here, gravity met stone. The Greeks did not vanish. The Greeks did not kneel. So the Persians came again. The second day's attacks, as described by ancient accounts, were not a single burst. They were repeated efforts, pushed forward by commanders, pulled back by losses, pushed forward again. Arrows rattled against shields and helmets. Some found flesh. Men fell. The line tightened and adjusted. The Greeks advanced in measured pulses, enough to strike, enough to disrupt, enough to force the Persians backward into their own crowded ranks. Then the Greeks withdrew, step by step, without breaking. This pattern, advance, press, withdraw, was the phalanx breathing. It was not a wall that never moved. It was a living structure that shifted without collapsing. And that, more than anything, was what Sparta trained for: to move together, to trust the rhythm, to obey without hesitation. In such fighting, there is no room for the individual ego. A man cannot step out of line to chase a personal victory. He cannot swing his sword wildly without risking his neighbor. He cannot turn his head too long without exposing the edge of his shield. Every small action affects the whole. King Leonidas, within this, was not merely a king. He was a node of stability. He could not be everywhere, but he did not need to be. His presence in the line, his calm among chaos, his refusal to be hurried by fear, these were forms of leadership stronger than shouted commands. The allies watched him. The Spartans watched one another, and slowly, the pass filled with evidence of the day's cost. Bodies began to pile in places where the Persian advance had been strongest. The road grew slick in patches. Dust stuck to sweat. The sun climbed higher and turned bronze hot to the touch. The smell of blood became constant, as if it had soaked into the stones themselves. Still, the gate held. It held because the Persians could not use their full numbers. Only a fraction of their army could engage at once. The rest waited behind, pushing forward when commanded, stepping over the fallen, moving into a space that did not widen for them, no matter how much they wanted it to. The Greeks, by contrast, rotated their front ranks. When a man grew too exhausted to hold his shield steady, another stepped into his place. This kind of rotation required discipline and coordination. It was easier for the Greeks here because their line was smaller and more unified. Spartans were accustomed to such order. Many allied contingents were not as practiced, yet the narrow pass helped them. It simplified the fight into the one thing all hoplites understood. Hold your shield, keep your spear forward, and do not break. By the end of the second day, the emotional landscape had changed again. The Persians had learned that they could not simply overwhelm the Greeks with ordinary assaults. The Greeks had learned that they could withstand a second day of pressure, but they also felt the accumulating strain. For the Persians, losses could be absorbed. For the Greeks, each man mattered. As evening approached, the fighting eased once more, like a storm pulling back to sea. Men collapsed onto the ground with shields beside them. Water was passed along the line. Wounded men were attended as best as possible. There were no surgeons in the modern sense, only practical care, binding, and the hope that infection would not take hold. Some of the allies might have begun to feel something close to awe at the Spartans' composure. It is not that Spartans did not feel pain. It is that they had been trained to place pain in a distant part of the mind. Pain was not a command. It was a background. Night fell again over Thermopylae. The sea wind cooled the pass. The hot springs steamed more visibly in the cooler air. The stars came out, steady and indifferent. In the Greek camp, there would have been the quiet counting of supplies, the quiet calculation of how many spears remained unbroken, how many shields had taken deep hits, how many men could still stand. And there would have been the unspoken question, never fully voiced, because voicing it could make it heavier. How many days can we do this? Somewhere above, on the slopes and paths beyond the pass, the Phocians kept watch over the mountain track. It was their assignment to guard the higher route that could bypass the Greek line. They would have watched the darkness, listening to small sounds, believing the night belonged to them. But night belongs to no one. Night is where things move unseen. In the Persian camp, Xerxes would have been faced with a truth that kings rarely enjoy, a problem that does not yield to force alone. If the gate could not be broken from the front, then it needed to be opened another way. And whenever a powerful army cannot find a path, it begins to search for someone who knows the land, someone who can show them the way around. The Greeks, tired and bruised, still held the narrow gate. They had done what they came to do. But the earth around Thermopylae was older than their plans, older than their formations. It held paths in its folds and secrets in its shadows. The pass had held for 2 days, and in that holding, the battle had already become more than a fight for ground. It had become a fight for time, a fight to delay the future. As King Leonidas settled into the night, helmet near at hand, shield close enough to touch, he would have known that endurance is not only the ability to stand, it is the ability to stand again tomorrow. And tomorrow, the empire would not simply repeat itself. Tomorrow, something would change. Night at Thermopylae did not feel like night elsewhere. The pass held heat in its stones. The cliffs kept the wind from moving freely. The hot springs breathed their faint steam, and the air carried that mineral bitterness that reminded every man, every hour, where he stood. By the second evening, exhaustion lay across the Greek camp like a heavy cloak. Arms ached with the memory of holding shields all day. Hands were raw from spear shafts and leather straps. Throats were dry. Eyes were gritty with dust. And still, the line existed. Still, the gate held. But in war, the enemy is not only the man in front of you, it is also the unseen movement around you. It is the small decision made in darkness. It is the whisper that finds the one person willing to trade another man's life for his own advantage. In the Persian camp, Xerxes faced a problem that could not be solved by pride. His army had bled against a narrow strip of land for 2 days, and the strip of land had not widened for him. Numbers had not worked as numbers usually worked. So he did what powerful leaders often do when force fails. He searched for another path. Herodotus tells us that a local Greek named Ephialtes of Trachis came to Xerxes with an offer. His motive, in the most human sense, was simple: reward, wealth, favor, perhaps safety under Persian power when Greece fell. He told Xerxes of a mountain route, an old track that led over the hills and down behind the Greek position at Thermopylae. This path was called the Anopaia. It was not unknown to the Greeks. It was precisely why the Phocians had been placed on higher ground, to guard the route and prevent an outflanking maneuver. But a guard post, even a vigilant one, is not a wall, and night is generous to those who move carefully. Xerxes listened, and then he acted with cold efficiency. He ordered a detachment, often described as the Immortals under Hydarnes in Greek accounts, to march by night along the path, guided by Ephialtes. It is difficult to imagine the scale of such a movement. Even a detachment within a massive army is still large by Greek standards. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, moving in darkness, climbing through rugged terrain, stepping over roots and stones, maintaining silence as best as possible. Above them, the stars were bright. Below them, the sea was a darker presence, its surface barely visible, a subtle shifting shadow. The mountains did not care whose feet climbed them. The Persians moved with practiced coordination. They had crossed deserts, rivers, and foreign lands. A mountain path, though steep, was not beyond them. Guided by someone who knew each turn, each fork, each easy footing, they climbed steadily. On the upper slopes, the Phocian guards remained. They had fought bravely in the pass, but their special task was here, to hold the high route. They kept watch at night, likely with small fires kept low, eyes scanning darkness, ears listening for the wrong sound, stones dislodged, brush stirred, the faint murmur of many breaths. But the mountain has its own noises, wind through scrub, small animals moving, loose rock settling. A sentry can miss the meaning of a sound if he has heard too many sounds already. When the Persians finally came close enough, the Phocians realized something was wrong. Herodotus suggests that the Persians were detected, perhaps by the sound of their movement through fallen leaves, perhaps by an alert watchman, perhaps by something as simple as a shift in the darkness that did not belong. The Phocians roused. They formed. In the blackness, with limited time and uncertainty in every direction, they prepared to fight. But the Persians did not come to fight them. They came to pass them. Herodotus says the Persians shot arrows, and the Phocians, believing they were the main target, withdrew to higher ground to defend themselves. And while the Phocians held the heights, brave, but now irrelevant to the larger plan, the Persian detachment continued down the other side of the mountain, down toward the rear of Thermopylae, down toward the place where the Greek line for 2 days had been facing only forward. This was the weakness of holding a gate. If the enemy comes behind you, the gate becomes a trap. Dawn did not arrive all at once. It crept in with a pale edge over the mountains, soft light spilling into the pass, revealing smoke from low fires, glints of bronze, men sleeping with helmets near their heads. Somewhere, a messenger ran. There are different traditions of how the Greeks learned of the outflanking force. Herodotus mentions that the Greeks were warned, perhaps by the Phocians, perhaps by scouts, perhaps by locals. However the warning came, it arrived with the same weight. The Persians were behind them. The gate was about to close. When a man learns such news, his first instinct is to look for escape, to calculate distance, to find the road back. For most of the Greek contingents at Thermopylae, withdrawal was possible. Hard, dangerous, but possible. If they left quickly, they could still save their fighting strength for later battles deeper in Greece. and for the overall Greek war effort, there was sense in preserving forces. But King Leonidas carried a different burden. He carried Sparta. He carried prophecy. He carried the knowledge that if the line broke in panic, the retreat could become slaughter, and the Persian advance would be swift and devastating. So he made the decision that shaped everything that followed. He would stay. He would hold as long as holding was possible. And by staying, he would buy time for others to withdraw and prepare the next defense. Herodotus tells us that Leonidas dismissed most of the allies, sending them away. Not all left. The Thespians, under Demopylus, refused to depart and remained to fight. The Thebans remained too, though their presence is complex. Some accounts suggest they were held as hostages to ensure Theban loyalty. Others suggest they stayed under obligation or political pressure, but the heart of the final defense became clear. The Spartans would not abandon their post. To modern minds, this is often framed as pure sacrifice, almost romantic. To Spartans, it was a form of obedience. A king leads where duty requires. A Spartan holds the line. And if the gods have spoken that a king must die, then perhaps death is not the worst outcome. The camp changed quickly once the decision was made. Men who were leaving gathered their gear with urgency. They moved southward, glancing back with a mixture of gratitude, sorrow, and disbelief. They knew what they were witnessing. Men choosing to remain when departure was possible. Men choosing to become the delay. The remaining fighters, Spartans, Thespians, and those others who stayed, tightened their formation, prepared for a battle that would now come from more than one direction. The pass that had protected them for 2 days would soon become their confinement. Yet even as the Seleucids settled, there was no frantic collapse. This is what the agoge had built into the bones of King Leonidas and his men. The ability to look directly at a terrible fact and remain steady, to accept without trembling, to act with clarity rather than panic. In the widening daylight, the cliffs looked unchanged. The sea still rolled. The hot springs still steamed. But the atmosphere had shifted. It was the shift of inevitability becoming immediate. Persia was now both ahead and behind. Xerxes, at last, had found the way around the gate, and the narrow place that had been a shield was about to become a stage for the final act. King Leonidas would have known in that moment that history had narrowed to a single question, not whether they could win, but how long they could hold. Not whether they could live, but what their staying would allow others to do. Betrayal had opened the mountain path. Now the gate would close, and in the next chapter, the pass would fill once more. Not with uncertain waiting, but with the last, relentless pressure of empire. The morning of the final day at Thermopylae did not feel heroic. It felt clear, a hard clarity, like cold water. The message had come. The Persians were moving down the mountain path. The gate was no longer a gate, but a narrowing corridor with danger on both ends. The Greeks who could withdraw did so, quickly, quietly, without celebration. As they left, the air seemed to empty, not of men, but of possibility. And still, King Leonidas remained, not alone, never alone. Around him stood the 300 Spartans, men chosen for steadiness and lineage. With them stood the Thespians, refusing to depart, though they had been given the chance. The Thebans remained as well, their reasons tangled in politics and obligation. But the heart of the decision was Spartan. To stay was not only strategy, it was obedience to the identity that had shaped them since childhood. In Sparta, duty was a kind of gravity. It did not require persuasion. It did not ask for mood. It simply pulled a man where he was meant to stand. And so the remaining Greeks prepared. They tightened armor straps. They checked spear points. They adjusted shields that had been battered for 2 days. They looked at one another with the quiet recognition that there are moments when words are less helpful than breath. King Leonidas did not need to tell his men what was coming. They could see it in the way the day moved, in the way the pass felt narrower than before, in the way sound carried differently when you know it will soon become the sound of running feet and clashing bronze. When Xerxes' forces advanced again, they advanced with a new confidence. The day before, they had attacked a wall. Today, they were closing a net. From the front, Persian troops moved into the pass once more. Archers, infantry, and those elite units that had failed to break the Greeks earlier. From behind, the flanking detachment descended, approaching the rear positions, compressing the Greeks into the narrowing middle. The Greeks could not remain at their repaired wall and wait to be surrounded completely. So they did something that seems almost impossible when you picture the odds. They advanced. They moved forward into the pass and met the Persians with deliberate aggression. Not to win, not to push the enemy back forever, but to kill and disrupt and force the day to stretch longer. Herodotus describes the Greeks fighting with ferocity, pushing outward from their position and driving deep into the packed Persian ranks. The narrowness of the pass now worked in a different way. It allowed the Greeks to strike into crowded enemies who could not easily maneuver. The phalanx pressed forward, spears thrust, shields slammed, men fell. The Persian front ranks, forced into close combat, suffered again. Their archers could not use volleys freely without striking their own men. Their numbers became a burden in the constricted space, a mass that could not spread out to breathe. For a time, the fighting became something brutal and intimate, less like a battle line and more like a grinding crush of bodies where each step was contested. This was the last stand, not as a static stance, but as motion, a refusal to be contained too quickly. As the hours passed, the Greek spears began to break. This is inevitable in prolonged close combat. Wooden shafts crack under impact, spearheads bend, hands slip with sweat and blood. When spears broke, men drew swords. Greek short swords were secondary weapons, used when the spear was gone or too unwieldy in tight quarters. Spartans, trained for discipline rather than flamboyance, would have used them with controlled violence. Shortcuts, direct thrusts, efficient movements. But swords meant the enemy was closer, so close that the breath of the man opposite you matters, so close that the sound you hear most clearly is the sound of bodies struggling. Herodotus tells us that in this final struggle, King Leonidas fell. The details of how he died are not precisely preserved. We do not have a clear account of the specific blow, the specific moment. History, even when it remembers a man's name forever, often loses the exact instant when breath leaves the body. But we know that he died in the fighting. And when he died, his men did not abandon him. They fought over his body. They pushed forward and back in desperate effort to retrieve him, because in Sparta, the body of the king was not merely flesh. It was symbol. It was lineage. It was the visible center of their decision. Herodotus describes fierce struggle around Leonidas's corpse, with the Greeks managing to pull it back after heavy fighting. Around that point, the battle became even more intense. The Spartans were now fighting not only for time, but for their king. And still, the net tightened. The Persians behind drew nearer. Arrows began to fall more thickly as the Persians sought to avoid direct collision. Herodotus reports that Xerxes ordered his troops to use missiles, recognizing that close combat in the pass continued to favor the Greeks' heavy armor and discipline. In such a moment, the battlefield changes texture. The sound becomes sharper, more constant. The air becomes a place where death moves silently between heartbeats. A bronze helmet can stop a glancing arrow, but not all arrows glance. A shield can catch many, but not those that slip around its edge. And as fatigue deepens, the smallest mistakes become fatal. The remaining Greeks gradually withdrew toward a small hill or raised ground near the pass, an area where they could hold together as the Persians closed in from multiple sides. The position was less ideal than the narrow choke point, but it allowed them to stand as a unit rather than be cut apart in scattered pockets. Here, the last part of the last stand took shape. Spears were gone, swords dulled, hands bruised, shields heavy as stones. Men fought with whatever remained: blades, shield rims, fists, teeth, stubbornness. There is nothing clean about this kind of ending. It is not like a painted vase scene. It is closer to a storm, violent, loud, and indifferent to the hopes of individuals. Yet within that storm, there was still discipline. Even in collapse, Spartans tried to remain aligned. Even when outflanked, they tried to remain together. Because to die together is different from dying alone. And this difference mattered to them. In the final moments, the Persian missiles did much of the killing. Herodotus describes arrows falling so thickly they blotted out the sun. A poetic exaggeration, perhaps, but one that captures the feeling. The sky itself seemed filled with threat. The Thespians died with the Spartans. Their choice was not commanded by law in the same way Spartan obedience was. And that is what makes it remarkable. They stayed without being required to stay. They died largely without the legend that later crowned Sparta. And then it ended. Not with a single dramatic blow, but with silence arriving after noise, with bodies still on stones warmed by sun, with the pass finally open, not because the Greeks had been broken in spirit, but because there were no bodies left to hold it. Xerxes had taken the gate, but he had paid for it in time and blood and shock. The delay mattered. It gave the Greek fleet time to act at Artemisium. It gave Greece time to shift strategy, to prepare for what came next. And perhaps, just as important, it left behind a message carved into memory. That an empire can be slowed, that numbers can be resisted, that courage, disciplined and deliberate, can force the world to pause. The body of King Leonidas lay among his men, and though the Persians held the ground, they had not erased the meaning. The gate had fallen, but it had not surrendered. After the last sounds of combat faded, Thermopylae became something else. Not a battlefield anymore, a threshold where the living stepped carefully, as if the ground itself had changed. The sea still moved beside the pass, indifferent and steady. The cliffs still held their shape. The hot springs still breathed their mineral steam, as though the earth did not notice the brief violence of men. But men noticed. Those who survived and withdrew south carried the memory like a weight strapped to the chest. It was not only grief, it was also a kind of stunned clarity that the impossible had happened, and yet it had not broken the Greek will. The Persians held the pass now. The road into central Greece lay open. Xerxes could march forward with the vast momentum of empire. And he did. Athens, threatened and exposed, would soon be evacuated. The city would be burned by Persian forces, its temples damaged, its streets emptied of ordinary life. The idea of Greece, fragmented, quarrelsome, proud, seemed to flicker at the edge of extinction. But Thermopylae had done what it came to do. It bought time. Time for the Greek fleet to shift and fight at Artemisium, and later to regroup for the decisive naval confrontation at Salamis. Time for Athens to commit fully to sea power. Time for Sparta and the Peloponnesian states to reinforce the isthmus, to gather allied forces, to plan the next stand. The Greek war effort did not end at Thermopylae. It began to harden there because something changes in a people when they witness a refusal so complete that it cannot be explained as accident or confusion. King Leonidas had died, yes, but he had also proven that Persia could be delayed. He had shown that a king could stand with his men in the front line, not behind them. He had turned a narrow strip of land into a message, and messages travel farther than armies. Xerxes, despite taking the pass, did not escape its cost. The losses at Thermopylae were not merely numerical, they were psychological. The Persian army had not met a crumbling opponent. It had met discipline that did not bend easily. It had learned that Greece would not submit simply because submission seemed logical. When an empire discovers that fear does not work as expected, it must spend more than soldiers to conquer. It must spend certainty, and certainty is precious. After Thermopylae, the war continued in violent chapters. At Salamis, the Greek fleet, led by Athenian strategy, fought in narrow waters where Persian numbers again became less useful. Persia's fleet suffered heavy losses, and Xerxes, concerned for the security of his bridges over the Hellespont, eventually withdrew much of his force, leaving his general Mardonius to continue the campaign. Then came Plataea, where Greek hoplite armies met Persian forces on land and won a decisive victory. At Mycale, another Greek victory struck Persia's naval presence. The Persian invasion failed. Greece survived, and so Thermopylae, though a tactical defeat, became part of a larger Greek success. It occupied a strange and powerful place in memory, a loss that contributed to survival. Yet memory is never simple. Over time, King Leonidas became more than the man who lived in Sparta, married Gorgo, fathered Pleistarchus, and ruled within the constraints of ephors and elders. He became a symbol. Symbols are sharpened by retelling. They lose certain details and gain others. They become cleaner than life ever was. The true King Leonidas lived in a society built on harsh discipline and deep inequality. Spartan citizens supported by helot labor, constant vigilance, and a system that required control as much as courage. That complexity never fits easily into legend, and yet history is allowed to be complicated. A man can be both admirable and part of a brutal system. A stand can be both courageous and strategically necessary. The greatness of Thermopylae does not require pretending that Sparta was gentle. It requires acknowledging that within a hard world, a hard choice was made, and that choice shaped what followed. In the years after Thermopylae, Sparta honored its dead. The Spartans and their allies erected memorials, and one line, attributed to the poet Simonides, became the quiet heartbeat of the place. Stranger, tell the Lacedaemonians that we lie here, obedient to their laws. The power of the line is not in boasting. It is in simplicity. It does not say, we conquered. It does not say, we were invincible. It says, in effect, we did what we were required to do. That is Sparta distilled. Obedience, not in the sense of mindless submission, but in the sense of living within a code so deeply that you accept its final demand. King Leonidas's body was not allowed to disappear into foreign hands forever. Later tradition suggests his remains were returned to Sparta, honored and remembered as part of the royal line. His son, Pleistarchus, was too young to rule immediately. A regent, often identified as Pausanias, who later commanded at Plataea, guided Sparta's affairs during the boy's minority. Gorgo, the widow of King Leonidas, lived on. Ancient sources say little about her later life, but her continued presence in memory suggests the quiet endurance of Spartan women, those who remained when men marched away, who held households steady, who raised children in a world where absence and death were always possible. And what of Ephialtes, the man who betrayed the mountain path? Herodotus reports that he was later hunted. Betrayal earned him no lasting reward, only infamy. In Greek memory, his name became a kind of warning that one person's hunger for gain can open gates that armies cannot. Thermopylae, over centuries, became more than geography. It became a mirror. Each generation looked into it and found the lesson it wanted. Some saw courage. Some saw patriotism. Some saw sacrifice. Some saw the limits of freedom and the cost of defending it. But if you return to the quietest truth, it is this: Thermopylae mattered because it slowed the world. It took an empire that believed itself inevitable and forced it to stop and struggle and bleed at a narrow place where it could not simply pour forward. King Leonidas did not defeat Xerxes, but he proved Xerxes was not destiny. And this proof gave courage to others, to sailors at Salamis, to hoplites at Plataea, to city-states that might otherwise have submitted out of fear. A single stand, even a doomed one, can change what people believe is possible. And belief shapes action. If you stand at Thermopylae today, the pass is not exactly as it was. The sea has shifted. The land has changed. The road is different. Time alters everything it touches. But the idea remains. A narrow gate. A small force. A king who stayed. In the quiet after the story, when the mind begins to soften towards sleep, there is something strangely gentle in the legacy of King Leonidas. Not gentle, because the events were gentle, but because they remind us of something human. That meaning is not always found in winning. Sometimes it is found in holding, in standing, in doing what must be done, even when the outcome is known. So, The name endured, carried by poets, carved into stone, whispered through centuries, not because King Leonidas lived forever, but because, for a brief moment in a narrow pass, he showed the world what it looks like when a person refuses to move, and that refusal, quiet, disciplined, unadorned, became a kind of immortality. And now, the pass is quiet again. The sea moves the way it always has, steady, untroubled, washing softly against the shore of Thermopylae. The cliffs still stand, the wind still moves between stone and sky, and the narrow gate, once filled with the sound of shields and spears, has long since returned to silence. King Leonidas is gone, his men are gone, but the mountains remain, and somewhere in that stillness, there's a reminder that even the loudest moments in history eventually fade into quiet. Tonight, you don't need to hold a line. You don't need to stand against anything. You don't need to be strong for anyone. You can rest. Let the armor fall away. Let the shield lower. Let the weight of the day slip gently from your shoulders. If you enjoyed drifting through history with me tonight, you can quietly subscribe so you don't miss our next journey. And before you close your eyes completely, tell me where in the world you're listening from. It's always comforting to imagine this small, quiet gathering of listeners, spread across continents, all settling into sleep beneath different skies. Thank you for being here. Now, let the mountains fade. Let the sea grow distant. And let yourself drift. Good night.